Hey everyone, I hope that you are doing well. We are continuing our journey through 4th edition as though it was the newest edition of the game that's been released. We've looked at Keep on the Shadowfell, and in our world, the core books have been released: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, and we are making our way through the Player's Handbook and looking at it chapter by chapter, section by section, and digging into the details as we try to learn about the game, whether we're coming from a prior edition of the game or are brand new to D&D and this is our first version that we've ever played. You know, what do these rules look like? So we're really trying to have an open mind as we look at this and not take into consideration some of the things that have come later, and also maybe try to ignore some of the noise that we've heard about 4th edition so we can form our own opinions based on what we actually see in these books. So that's the world that we're in, and we're continuing this journey in the Player's Handbook. Today we are going to talk about skills. I don't expect this video to be as long as some of the other ones. We talked about races, we talked about classes, and there's a lot to take in those chapters. So we went through them, and it took quite a while to hit everything that we wanted to cover in there to really give a good overview. Skills are a little different. There's not quite as much to cover. It's also something that if you're coming from another edition of the game, it's going to be very familiar because these are very similar in how they function to what you would have had in 3rd edition, 3.5. Skills did not exist in the older editions of the game. If you're coming from 5th edition, you also have skills, and they function in a similar way as that. There's some of the specifics of the rules are a little bit different. Obviously, some of the checks that you would do would have a different scale because the math is a little bit different, but the idea behind skills is the same as these other editions of the game. If you are brand new to Dungeons and Dragons, just understand that a skill is essentially kind of the non-combat things that your character can do. We have powers and class features and things that cover a lot of the combat stuff and give you bonuses for different things in combat. But a skill has to do with your exploration, your social encounters, you're going through a dungeon and you're checking out a monster, so all those other things outside of combat that you might be doing in a game. There's a whole thing with skill challenges that we'll talk a little bit about, but that's really something that'll be in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But it's all the non-combat stuff that happens in the game. And so your character has abilities that they can do, things that they've studied up on, that they've trained in, that are not related to combat. And that's really where the skills would come into play. So let's take a look at what some of this means and how what kind of choices you might have to make. So the key thing that we want to talk about is that there's different ways of doing skills. If you're coming from a prior edition of the game, then you're going to see some substantial differences in how you in the abilities or the bonuses that you get for your different skills. In addition, you're going to see a vast reduction in the number of skills. There are 17 skills in 4th edition. By my count, 3.5 had 45 skills that you could be trained in, which is a lot. Now, some of those there's like a lot of different knowledge skills. Those have been kind of consolidated into just some specific checks that you might do. So there's just a lot of different skills that you had in prior editions that's been very streamlined to make it much easier to keep track of and to play. And also the way that you leveled up in your skills is different in 4th edition from what you had in 3rd edition. And honestly, this has been different in every edition of the game, has different ways that you level up in skills. It's one of those things where they're constantly trying to tweak it and find a better way to go about it. In 3rd edition, 3.5, you had skill ranks that you would assign to the different skills depending on which ones you wanted to. So like when you leveled up, you might get, say, 7 skill ranks. Each of those was 1 point that you could assign to one of your skills that you had out there, and you would assign those to the skills that you really wanted to focus on. So if you wanted to focus on stealth, you would assign skill ranks to stealth, and you would increase your bonus that you would get for stealth checks. If you had other ones you want to do, you would assign it. So depending on what you want to do with your character, you would assign those skill ranks accordingly. 4th edition is a little different in that you choose early on in your character, you choose what skills you're going to be trained in. and then you get a bonus for those. And then as you level up, you get to add half your level to your skill bonuses to increase those. And then at different points in the game, you would have ability score increases, and those would factor into into increasing your bonus for your skills as well. So that's just some differences you had there. Looking at some of the, getting into this. So we mentioned the training, and what happens is if you watch the last video, we went through the classes and it talked about the skills that you're trained in. And so every class has a set of skills that they would be class skills for that particular class. And you would choose several of those skills as part of creating your character if you're creating it for that particular class. And any skill that you choose to be trained in, you get a +5 bonus for that skill. So like for a cleric, I think you get religion, and then you get to choose like 3 other skills. And so every one that you're trained in, you get a +5 bonus. And there's other things as you're creating your character that might give you additional bonuses to your skills. And then you would add your ability score to it, and you would add half your level, and you end up with a number that is the skill bonus that you would attach. So when someone says to roll an acrobatics check, you would look on your character sheet, and all those numbers would add up to a bonus that you would get. You'd roll your d20, you would add in that bonus, and there you go. That's your result that you get for that acrobatics check, and the DM would tell you whether you succeeded or not. There are some feats that you can choose that allow you to choose training in class skills that are not part of your class. So those are feats as well if you wanted to go that route. So there are other options to get training in additional skills as well. So looking at the list here, you can see there are 17 skills on this list, and note that each one has a different ability score that it goes to. So like acrobatics is related to your dexterity, arcana is related to your intelligence. So once you know what your dexterity modifier is, then your acrobatics at its base is going to be the same as what your dexterity modifier is. So if you have a +2 to dexterity, your acrobatics would also be +2. But then it's also a class skill for a ranger, and it's class skill for a rogue. So you may, as you're building your ranger character, choose to be trained in acrobatics. And if you choose to be trained in acrobatics, then you're going to get a +5 bonus for that. So now it's going to be your dexterity plus that +5 bonus. So if your dexterity was +2 and you're a ranger and you decide to be trained in acrobatics as being a ranger, that's going to be a +5. You're going to now have a +7 to your acrobatics. And on top of that, you're going to add half your level. So if you're, say, a level 3 character, that's going to be half your level rounded down is going to be a 1. So that's going to be another +1. So you already had a +7. Now it's going to be a +8 that you would get to acrobatics. So as you level up your character, all these skill values are going to also increase as part of that. And like I said, you can, if you're so let's say that you're a cleric, Arcana is a cleric class skill. But let's say that you wanted to be trained in acrobatics for whatever reason. As a cleric, you still wanted to be trained in acrobatics. Well, it's not a class skill for a cleric, so you wouldn't by default have that. But there's, and I don't know if there's what the feat is. So I assume there's a feat out there that would allow your cleric to be trained in acrobatics, and you can add that to one of your training skills if you select that feat. So, and then you'd get that +5 bonus for it. So that's kind of the way that the skills work. It starts out with that ability score. Your ability modifier is the base. And then if you're trained in it, you're going to get a +5. And then you're going to add half your level. And then you may even have some other bonuses depending on some other things that you have available to you. So you might also have penalties depending on, maybe like the armor that you're wearing. So there's other things that factor in. But the net result is you're going to end up with each of your skills is going to have some kind of bonus. It might be a 0, it might be a +10, and then it'll change every time you level up, and that's going to be the bonus you add to your d20 whenever you are asked to do a skill check of some sort. The next part of this talks about using skills, which I kind of talked about already, about the different bonuses. You're going to add half your level, you're going to add your ability modifier, and then you're going to add your +5 bonus if you are trained in that skill. And then there's some other things in here. There may be armor check penalties. So I kind of already covered that. Got a little ahead of myself here. And then the core thing, if you remember going back to the core rules, the core mechanic was something we covered early on in this book, is you're always going to reach for that D20. and then you're going to add in some sort of bonus to that. So same thing with a skill check. At some point, the DM might say, go ahead and roll a stealth check or roll acrobatics check. You're going to grab your D20, you're going to roll it, and then you're going to add whatever the bonus is that you have on your character sheet for acrobatics or stealth or whatever skill it was that the DM was calling for. And that's essentially how it's going to work. And the DM will decide then whether that was successful or whether it was a failure. And how do they do that? Well, that's the next section here, difficulty class. The DM, and we'll get to it on the following pages, it'll talk a little bit about the difficulty class. Essentially what happens is when the DM is, when someone says they want to do something, so you want to jump on top of something, you want to jump over a stream or something like that. There's rules around that. There are mechanics that the DM would follow that determines whether or not you're getting a running start or whether you're doing a standing jump, trying to jump across this stream. And based on those circumstances would determine what the difficulty class is for that particular check. And it might turn out to be that they determine the difficulty of completing that task would be a 12. And therefore they're saying that you would need to roll an acrobatics check and you need to get at least a 12 in order to succeed at this. And so they would ask you to roll your acrobatics check. You grab your D20, you add your acrobatics bonus to it, and you report back and you say, I rolled a 14. And the DM, having determined that that difficulty class for that action would be a 12, would say, okay, you successfully jump over the stream. Or if the difficulty class for it was a 16 and you only rolled a 14, they would say, no, you failed and you're now floating in the stream and the water's washing over you or something like that. And depending on how fast that water's going, perhaps you're even getting pulled under and there's a more dire situation than simply getting wet. So that's the circumstance. And the idea is that, you shouldn't really ask for someone to roll a skill check unless there's going to be some consequence if they fail. Sometimes there's a school of thought that says just you got to have people roll the skill checks no matter what, because then they don't know how serious it is. So if every time you ask them to roll a skill check, there's always some kind of major consequence, then they're going to know that there's a major consequence, and that's called a little bit of metagaming. So, but anyway, the general way that the DM does it, they will determine the difficulty class for it. They will ask you to roll, and then they will compare it. Much like attacking a monster, you roll your D20, add in your attack bonuses, and they will compare that against the armor class or whatever for that monster and determine whether you hit. You're basically doing the same thing here with these skill checks. The other type of check is an opposed check. This would come into things. The most common one is really like stealth would be one where if you're trying to be sneaky, and you're trying to cross a room and not be detected, you may be asked to roll a stealth check, but the DM is not going to just choose a difficulty class for it. What the DM is going to do is say, okay, what's the monsters or the NPCs that are in this room? And they're going to roll a perception check for those creatures. And so let's say that it's a room and it's just you and it's one other creature, and you're trying to be stealthy and sneak around to the other side of the room. And they're going to say, all right, roll a stealth check. And then they're going to roll a perception check, and essentially they're just going to compare the numbers. And if they roll the perception check for that NPC or the monster and it comes back as a 13, and you rolled your stealth check and it came back as a 15, then you succeeded. You're stealthy. They didn't see you. But if it's the other way around and they rolled a 15 perception and you only rolled a 13 stealth, well, then they see you. And there could even be variations. They may even look at it and say, well, if it was really close, it was only off by 1, then maybe they heard a noise, but they didn't actually see you. Or if it was way off, you rolled a natural 1 or something, then you stumble over the rack of weapons and make a whole big commotion instead of being stealthy. So, but that's the other kind of check. So the one, the DM is setting the difficulty. The other one, they're actually rolling whatever that difficulty would be based on the scores that the other creature has that you're opposing the check. And that could come in with other ones as well. Stealth is definitely a common one. Thievery might be another one. Bluff and intimidate, diplomacy. Those are all ones that could fall into the category of opposed checks because those have counters to them. So if you're trying to bluff somebody, then they're going to have an insight score. And so you would roll a bluff check. They would roll an insight check to see whether you're bluffing, and you're kind of competing in that way. So those are interesting because it's not just a DM set thing. It's actually, you're really going up against another creature in the encounter. The next thing we have is checks without rolls. And this kind of goes back to where, if you're not going to have a consequence, then, maybe you don't need to have a check. But then there's a couple other examples here. There's the take 10, where if let's say that you're trying to pick a lock, normally you would roll a thievery check to try to pick that lock and, to see if you're successful. The idea is that, well, if you've got like a bunch of monsters bearing down on you, or there's some kind of time limit that you've got, someone's about to enter the room or you're about to be discovered, then you need to roll that check, and there's some urgency to it. And so you'd roll the check and see how it goes and hope for the best. But if you don't have that kind of urgency and you just have as much time as you need to do the task, then you just do a take 10, and essentially you say that, okay, I roll a 10 plus whatever my bonus is. So in the case, your thievery, you might have say you have a +8 to thievery. If there's a lot of pressure to get it done fast, then you got to roll the die, and you roll a 3, and then you add your 8, and now you're at a +11, or your thievery check was an 11. If there's not that stress, then you just take 10 and you add your bonus, and it's an 18. And, likely that's probably good to do the thing. If it's still not, if it's a really complicated lock or something, then there's a whole other things that you can do. But anyway, that's the idea, is that the skill check is really there for when you have some dire need. And if you don't have that sort of stress, then you can always just do a take 10. I think the idea might be that it's you're taking like 10 minutes to do it. And eventually, if you rolled enough times, you would get a 10 and it would be fine. So that's the idea there. Passive checks are for when you're walking through a dungeon or a room or a town. What do you see just anyway? If you had to stop every 5 feet and roll a perception check, that the game would drag down pretty quickly. So a passive check just simply says, and on your character sheet, you'll see that you've got passive insight and passive perception. And that's basically it's like the taking 10. You have a 10 plus whatever your bonus is, and that's your passive perception. So if something is happening around you that would be visible to somebody who rolls a 12 on their perception check, and you have a passive perception of 14, then you're going to see those things. They're just going to be there. They're going to be obvious to you. And that's the DM would use those to help determine whether or not you see that kind of stuff going on. Cooperation is interesting. So if you have a skill that you're going to do where it's something where you could help somebody, then the group could work together to try to make the thing happen. So like, let's say that you're trying to open a heavy door, and the DM says, that you need to do an athletics check to try to open this door. If you just did it by yourself, that would be fine, but you could try, where up to 4 people in the party could try to assist you. So you would roll yours, or whoever has the highest athletics bonus would roll the check as a base, and then up to 4 other people in the party could roll a d20, and if they roll at least a 10, then they get to help. So they would roll an athletics check, and if they get at least a 10, then you get to add a +2 to your check. And that can come in handy. So if you're trying to move this heavy door and you do it by yourself, and it's going to take you a little while, but if you get 4 other people and they all pass and they're able to assist you, then you got 4 or 5 people helping you open this door, and you can open it that much faster, or you can open a heavier door, whatever it is. So those come in handy. But you can't do that for every type of skill, particularly like knowledge checks. There's not really a way that you can help somebody remember something. So a knowledge check is to try to recall some piece of knowledge about something. You really either know it or you don't. And so I don't know that there's ways that, someone could try to help you remember that knowledge. So depending on the circumstances, the DM may or may not allow the cooperation. So it definitely depends on what the check is and what it is that you're trying to do. Skill challenges. There's a little bit here about skill challenges, and if you've heard anything about 4th edition, you've probably heard about skill challenges. They are definitely another one of those love them or hate them things, and they are mostly covered in the Dungeon Master's Guide. This is just a reference indicating that there are skill challenges. They exist, And so they're a way to do non-combat encounters and in kind of a more structured way. We will talk more about those when we get to the Dungeon Master's Guide. For now, just understand that there are ways to have skill checks that are more involved than just simply making a singular check to do something. And then it talks about knowledge skills. And we kind of talked a little bit about this as well of, the different levels of knowledge. And I'll flip to the next page because it talks about how, depending on the result that you get. So like common knowledge would be just a DC 10. Those are pretty easy to get. But then as you go up, you'd have to roll like a 25 to get a piece of knowledge that is like really obscure about something. So if you're trying to find out about some kind of scroll and do some kind of knowledge check about the scroll or about a creature that's not a very well-known creature or something like that, depending on what the information is that you're trying to get, it will be harder and harder to get depending on how specific it is. So you can't just succeed at a knowledge check and that's it. It does have a difficulty in the same way that jumping over that stream, depending on how wide that stream is going to be a different athletics check that you would need to run. The difficulty class for it would be different. Same goes for knowledge. The more obscure the knowledge, the harder that check is going to be. You can look here specifically about the monster knowledge, and it talks about how if you roll a 15, well, you'll know what the monster is, and you might know some of the keywords. If you roll a 20, you'd know what kind of powers that monster has. You roll a 25, then you could see what kind of resistances and vulnerabilities. And then there's additional things depending on if it's a Paragon tier or Epic tier creature. So, but you can see how it's not all the same. You get different levels of information depending on how well you rolled. And that's kind of the foundational stuff for the skills. And if anybody's coming from a prior edition of D&D that had skills, there's really not anything here that is new. Nothing here is something that was groundbreaking in 4th edition. Most of these things, I'd maybe even argue that all of these things exist in 3rd edition, 3.5, 5th edition. All in some form they have these. Maybe skill challenges would be the only thing that you don't see overtly in those editions. The number of skills is vastly reduced, but this is all familiar to somebody who's coming into 4th edition from another one. If you're brand new, well, then it's just a new thing, and all of this stuff would be something that you're learning as part of playing the game. But I don't think it's not really terribly complicated. It's really just, things that the character would do outside of their typical combat type stuff. And that's the baseline for it. If we look at the skills themselves, and we'll kind of gloss through these because I don't know that there's necessarily value in really digging into all the different skills. Certainly if you've got the player's handbook and you're looking through it, you'll read through these and you'll get a feel for the circumstances when you would use that particular skill. There's got a lot of good examples in here, as well as the difficulty classes that you would have for different things that you would want to try. So acrobatics, it's based on dexterity. It is subject to an armor check penalty. So, and if you look at your equipment, there are certain pieces of armor that would have a check penalty on them. And so this one is subject to that. And you can see it on the character sheet. There's a line for those skills that would be impacted by an armor check penalty. There's actually a field for you to put in that penalty. So acrobatics would be one of those, because obviously if you're wearing like full plate armor, you're not going to be as acrobatic as you would if you were just wearing hide armor or something. And so then, it goes into detail. So here's this is like a stunt. This is you trying to do something that's kind of acrobatic. You're trying to jump over something or roll through something or do something that, requires some agility. Here's a little bit of guidance on what that would be and what success and failure look like. Balancing on a rope bridge or a log that you cut down and set across a stream. This is, you're trying to keep your balance on something, or there's maybe it's a wagon that's moving and you're needing to stand up and do something. This would be an acrobatics check that you would do to check for balance. And you can, it's got a lot of extra detail. If you fail by 4 or less, then you get this. If you fail by 5 or more, then this happens. You might actually grant combat advantage. So there's a lot of good detail here to help you with the consequences of failure of a particular check. But you also have escaping from a grab, escaping from restraints, reducing damage. And then this one has the note that says you can only do that if you're trained. So you'd have to be, in order to reduce fall damage, by rolling an acrobatics check, you would have to be trained in it. So if you're falling off of a ledge onto the ground, you could roll an acrobatics check to reduce the amount of damage you could take, but you can only do that if you're actually trained in acrobatics. And so not just everybody can do an acrobatics check for that particular situation. And that's the idea. So that you see that with acrobatics, and we see the similar things for all of the other skills as well. Arcana, there's got, there's arcanic knowledge, monster knowledge. You can do detect magic. And again, we get similar thing where it breaks it down into what kinds of information that you would get if you're doing this detect magic, which is also a trained only skill. We get into strength, and you got a whole bunch of detail about climbing and how that works and what happens if you fail on the climb. I was talking a little bit before about the jump and whether you're going to do a high jump. And it's like, if you are just standing still and you're going to jump straight up, there's one thing. But if you're going to actually get a running start, then that changes what the difficulty would be for that and how far you could go. A long jump is the same thing. Are you just going to stand at the edge of the ledge and try to jump across? Or are you able to move a couple squares and get a running start to go over the edge? If you're going to have to swim, what's the water like? Is it calm? Is it rough? Is it stormy? So you could see the level of detail that you have in all of these skills, and really all the different stuff that you can do. And the thing that's, we talk about combat versus non-combat, and, combat is very, there's a lot of rules about combat and everything, but there's quite a few rules here. And these are really about kind of letting your imagination work and really thinking about what your character can do, because the skills really get open-ended. You're limited only by what your imagination is in what your character can do. And you can always make a suggestion, say, hey, can I do this thing? And let the DM decide, whether, no, sorry, that's just not something we're going to do, or say, yeah, you can try it, but he or she is going to set a difficulty class of like 35. Whereas it could be really hard to do it. Or they might come back and say, well, yeah, you'd need to succeed at an athletics check to do the first part, and then an acrobatics check to do the second part, and then probably a streetwise check to do the third part. I don't know. So it might be, where there's a combination of things you have to do in order to succeed, but you have carte blanche to do whatever, make whatever ideas you have and get them out there and decide, how creative you want to be with your character to try to resolve that situation that you're in. The bluff is, trying to fool somebody into believing what you're saying. Diplomacy is trying to, kind of convince them of your intentions. Dungeoneering is good. That's another one that's got some monster knowledge. So depending on the type of monster, you would use a different check. So some monsters you would use a dungeoneering check to learn about that monster. Other ones you use an arcana check or a religion check or a nature check, depending on the type of monster. And it indicates here. So an aberrant creature, you would use a dungeoneering check to learn information about that monster while you're in a dungeon. Foraging for food while in a dungeon. Endurance checks. So like this was a nice one. So, for like survival type thing. So if you're outside in extreme weather, it's, how do you set that DC? Resisting disease, that one probably would be more about you'd have to look at the disease itself and see there'd be information about that. Ignoring hunger after 3 weeks. So if you haven't eaten in 3 weeks, you get, what's the difficulty class for that is 20 plus 5 per day. So there's, again, lots of detail in how you can check for these things, and they're never going to check for everything. There's never going to be information for every little circumstance, but there's quite a bit covered in here. Heal is one that definitely comes in handy, because that's something somebody is in a dying condition and you can use your heal check to try to stabilize them. If you come across an NPC that is injured, you can use a heal check to try to treat that as well. History is another type of knowledge check. Insight is to try to see if somebody's being honest with you or they're lying. Nature is another one where you can learn about different monsters. If you're in some kind of terrain, you can kind of learn about what that terrain is. Foraging for food out in the wilds versus the dungeoneering, where you would forage for food in a dungeon. So it's, similar check, but you're using a different skill, and you may not be trained on both of those skills. Perception, very common, just to try to find and see what's around you. Religion is, obviously much like nature, much like arcana. It's another type of training that you would have had, and you see similar things. It's like religious knowledge, monster knowledge. I thought there was going to be more, but there's just those two. And then stealth, another one that you will use a lot. And you can see there's a lot of information about how to be stealthy and how does this work and what happens if you fail and how do you stay hidden if you are hidden, and what if the enemies move, what if you make an attack. Lots of information about that one. Streetwise would be kind of getting information while you're in a town and dealing with people in that town. Thievery, this one also, if you're a rogue, going to be very important. Disabling traps, picking locks, picking pockets, all those sorts of things that you would expect a thief to do. Very nimble fingers to handle all those sorts of things. Lots of good examples here for that. And I think that's it. So that's the end of the skills. So, I know I glossed over those, but I think this is more of a chapter where it's like, I'm not going to sit here and read the whole book. I probably already covered them more than I should have, because the idea is that it's just about all that non-combat stuff that you might have to do. And, you get training in those things, you get bonuses for it. And the dungeon master will tell you, what to roll, and you say what you want to do. The dungeon master will tell you what you want to roll. And it will say acrobatics or thievery or stealth, whatever it is, you roll, and then they will determine whether you got it, either through setting a difficulty class or through an opposed check where there's another creature that you're going to be rolling against. So it makes it really interesting because your exploration and your social encounters have these mechanics that you can use to kind of work your way through those, much like what you have with your combat where you're rolling attacks and things, but it's just a little different. So this chapter is really good. It goes in a lot of good detail on all those different things and gets you a really good understanding of what those skills do and how you might use them. I like all the examples because that's what you really need, especially if you're a new player and you're not really sure what to do in different circumstances. You get into a spot where you're just you're at the table and the dungeon master describes a situation and then just says, what do you want to do? And you don't really know. You're not the character. You're the player and you're trying to be the character. This chapter is really good at helping you understand all the different types of things you can do and get that imagination going, and you can come up with your own ideas then and let the DM tell you what that skill would be and the difficulty and all that sort of thing. So good chapter. I think having an understanding of that will definitely help you as you're planning out your character, and hopefully this overview helped you out in understanding it, whether you're coming from an old edition or new to Dungeons and Dragons. It was something that you found helpful. We will continue this journey in future videos. I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to go next. I have a couple different options in mind, so I will decide that. And then, but there will be more videos as we dig into this even further. So if you have ideas of what you would like to see next, if you think I glossed over anything a little too quickly, put those down in the comments. Love to hear everything that you have to say about it. Love to hear your experiences. If you played 4th edition when it came out, and what was some of your experiences with it. If you are brand new to 4th edition or to Dungeons and Dragons in general, I'd love to hear from you, especially with what would help you to get into the game, and what would you like to see to learn more about D&D and 4th edition in particular. So put all that stuff down in the comment. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Check out the newsletter if you are interested in that as well. Those links are down in the description. If you want to help the channel in other ways, there are some other links, affiliate links down there as well, and that always helps to keep things moving and helps to show your support. So I appreciate those as well. But that's what we have for today. There will be more videos coming. So until next time, take care.